Imagine waking up in a world where almost everything around you was made by hand. Your clothes, your shoes, your tools, even the nails holding together your house. There are no assembly lines, no humming machinery, no giant buildings filled with thousands of workers. Instead, production happens in cottages, barns, and small workshops. This was the reality of the world before the Industrial Revolution. For thousands of years, human economies changed very slowly. A blacksmith forged tools one at a time. A weaver worked thread into cloth on a wooden loom. A carpenter built furniture piece by piece. But beginning in the late 1700s, something extraordinary happened in Britain. A new type of building began appearing across the countryside. These buildings were large. They were loud. They were powered by water and later by steam. Inside them were machines that could do the work of dozens, sometimes hundreds of people. They were called factories. And they would transform not just how goods were produced, but how humans lived. This is the story of the birth of the industrial world. A story of inventors and entrepreneurs, of rivers turned into engines of power, of workers leaving villages for smoky new towns, and of the first factories that changed history forever. To understand how revolutionary factories were, we first need to step into the world that existed before them. Picture a typical English village around the year 1700. A few hundred people live there. Most families work the land. Life revolves around the rhythm of the seasons. Planting in the spring, harvest in the autumn. Cold winters spent indoors repairing tools and spinning wool. Manufacturing exists, but on a very small scale. Historians call this system the domestic system, or the putting out system. Here's how it worked. A merchant from a nearby town would deliver raw materials to rural households. For example, wool. A farmer's family might receive a bundle of wool fibers. During spare hours, they would spin the wool into thread. Then the merchant would collect the thread and deliver it to another household, perhaps a weaver, who would turn it into cloth. Finally, the cloth would go to another worker who finished and dyed it. Production was scattered across dozens of homes. No central workplace existed. And because every step was done manually, production was slow. Extremely slow. A skilled spinner might produce only a small amount of thread in an entire day. A single weaver working a loom could take several days to produce one piece of cloth. For centuries, this system worked reasonably well. But by the early 1700s, demand for textiles, especially cotton, was rising dramatically. Population in Europe was growing, global trade was expanding, and British merchants were discovering something important. If they could produce cloth faster and cheaper than competitors, they could dominate global markets. But the domestic system had a problem. It simply couldn't scale. You could hire more spinners and more weavers, but coordination became chaotic. Production bottlenecks appeared constantly, and this created the perfect conditions for innovation. The first major technological breakthrough happened in spinning. Spinning thread had always been one of the slowest steps in textile production. A traditional spinning wheel allowed a worker to spin only one thread at a time. But in the 1760s, an inventor named James Hargreaves created something remarkable. A machine called the spinning jenny. Instead of spinning one thread, the spinning jenny could spin 8 threads simultaneously. Later versions could spin dozens. Suddenly, one worker could do the work of many. At first, these machines were small enough to be used inside homes. But the trend was clear. Textile production was beginning to accelerate. And with acceleration came a new problem. Weaving couldn't keep up with spinning. Soon, warehouses were overflowing with thread. Another invention was needed. The next breakthrough came from an inventor named Richard Arkwright. Arkwright had a radical idea. Instead of small machines scattered across homes, what if large machines were concentrated in a single building? And instead of relying on human muscle, what if they were powered by water? Rivers had powered mills for centuries, grinding grain into flour. But Arkwright realized that they could power textile machinery too. In 1771, he built one of the first modern factories at Cromford in Derbyshire. The building stood beside a fast-flowing river. Water rushed through a channel and turned a massive wheel. That wheel powered shafts and gears running throughout the building. Those gears drove spinning machines on multiple floors. For the first time in history, large numbers of workers gathered in one place to operate machines powered by an external energy source. This was the factory system, and it was revolutionary. Production became faster, more organized, and far more efficient than the old domestic system. But the factory also created something new. A new type of worker. Before factories existed, most people worked close to home. Farmers worked their fields, artisans worked in small workshops, families controlled their own schedules. Factories changed that. Inside a factory, work was no longer flexible. Machines ran on strict timetables. Workers had to arrive at a specific time. They worked long shifts, often 12 to 14 hours per day. The sound inside early textile mills was overwhelming. Hundreds of machines clattered and rattled simultaneously. The air was filled with cotton dust. And because factories needed large labor forces, owners often recruited entire families. Men, women, and children worked together on the factory floor. Children in particular were highly valued workers. They were small enough to crawl beneath machines and tie broken threads. But the conditions could be harsh. In many early factories, safety regulations simply didn't exist. Yet despite the hardships, factories kept expanding because economically, they were unstoppable. Factories could produce goods faster and cheaper than anything the old world had ever seen. And soon, factories began spreading across Britain. This raises an important question. Why did the Industrial Revolution begin in Britain? Why not France, or China, or India, places with long traditions of textile production? The answer lies in a unique combination of factors. First, Britain had abundant coal. Coal would soon become the fuel that powered steam engines and heavy industry. Second, Britain had a stable political system that protected private property and encouraged investment. Third, the country had an expanding global empire and access to international markets. And fourth, Britain possessed a network of rivers perfect for water-powered mills. Entrepreneurs across the country began building factories near these rivers. Soon, entire regions were transforming. Quiet, rural valleys filled with large industrial buildings. Workers migrated from farms to factory towns. And the rhythm of life began to change. Human society was entering the age of industry. But the factory system was only the beginning, because soon another invention would arrive that would make factories even more powerful. The steam engine. And once steam entered the factory, industry would no longer depend on rivers. Factories could be built anywhere. Cities would explode in size, and the industrial world would truly begin. At the end of the 18th century, the factory system was still limited by one crucial factor: water. Factories had to be built next to rivers powerful enough to turn water wheels. When the river flowed strongly, machines ran smoothly. When water levels dropped, production slowed or stopped entirely. Industry was tied to geography. But soon, a new invention would break that limitation forever. The steam engine, and with it, factories would escape the rivers and move into cities. The story of steam power begins decades before the great textile mills appeared. In the early 1700s, Britain faced a growing problem in its coal mines. As miners dug deeper underground, water constantly flooded the tunnels. Removing that water by hand was slow and expensive. Mine owners needed a machine that could pump water out efficiently. In 1712, an inventor named Thomas Newcomen built one of the first practical steam engines. Newcomen's machine used steam to move a large piston inside a cylinder. That piston powered a pump that removed water from mines. It worked, but it had a serious drawback. The engine consumed enormous amounts of coal. For many industries, it was simply too inefficient to be practical. For decades, steam engines remained mostly confined to coal mines. Then, in the 1760s, a Scottish instrument maker named James Watt began studying Newcomen's design. Watt realized the problem was heat loss. Every time the engine cooled and reheated, energy was wasted. His solution was brilliant. Instead of cooling the main cylinder, Watt added a separate condenser. This allowed the engine to operate continuously without losing heat. The result was a steam engine far more efficient than anything that came before. Suddenly, steam power became economically viable. Factories were no longer tied to rivers. They could now be built anywhere. And that changed everything. By the late 18th century, steam engines were beginning to appear inside textile mills. Instead of water wheels turning the machinery, massive steam engines now powered spinning frames and looms. These engines drove long rotating shafts that ran across factory ceilings. Belts connected the shafts to individual machines. When the engine started, the entire factory came alive. Rows of machines began spinning, weaving, and clattering in perfect mechanical rhythm. Production accelerated dramatically. Factories grew larger, and the demand for labor exploded. As industrial production increased, Britain began experiencing something it had never seen before: the rise of industrial cities. Before the Industrial Revolution, most people lived in rural villages. Cities existed, of course, but they were relatively small. London was an exception, but most towns contained only a few thousand inhabitants. Factories changed that. Industrialists built mills where power, labor, and transportation could be concentrated. Workers migrated from countryside farms to these new industrial centers. One city in particular became the symbol of this transformation: Manchester. In the early 1700s, Manchester was a modest market town. By the early 1800s, it had become one of the fastest-growing industrial cities in the world. Textile mills lined the rivers. Factory chimneys towered above dense neighborhoods of brick housing, the air filled with smoke from coal-burning engines. Visitors arriving in Manchester often described the city as overwhelming. The streets were crowded, the factories thundered with noise, and everywhere, thousands of workers rushed to and from their shifts. To some observers, Manchester represented the future. To others, it looked like a warning, because industrial cities brought both opportunity and hardship. Factory work offered wages that rural farming often could not match. For many families, industrial employment meant the possibility of economic improvement. But life in early industrial cities could also be extremely difficult. Housing was built quickly to accommodate the flood of workers. Entire neighborhoods of small brick houses appeared almost overnight. Many lacked proper sanitation. Clean water was often scarce. And because factories operated long hours, the rhythm of city life changed dramatically. Instead of following the natural cycle of sunrise and sunset, workers now lived according to factory clocks. The workday could begin before dawn, and it might end long after dark. For the first time in human history, large numbers of people lived under a strict industrial schedule. The factory bell determined when work began, when breaks occurred, and when workers were finally allowed to go home. Inside the mills, the environment was intense. Hundreds of machines operated simultaneously. The noise could be deafening. Workers communicated with gestures because conversation was nearly impossible. The air inside textile factories was warm and humid. This was intentional. Factory owners discovered that moist air reduced thread breakage and cotton spinning. But it also meant workers spent long hours breathing cotton dust. Despite these conditions, industrial production kept expanding. Textile factories multiplied across northern England. Cities such as Leeds, Birmingham, and Liverpool grew rapidly, and Britain soon became known as the workshop of the world. Its factories produced enormous quantities of textiles, tools, iron goods, and manufactured products. British cloth was exported across Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Industrial capitalism was emerging. Investors financed new factories. Entrepreneurs searched constantly for ways to increase efficiency. Inventors designed new machines that could work faster and cheaper than ever before. Each innovation triggered another wave of industrial expansion. But this transformation also produced tension. Not everyone benefited equally from the new system. Some traditional craftsmen saw their livelihoods disappearing. Handloom weavers struggled to compete with power-driven looms. Artisans who once controlled their work now faced competition from mechanized factories capable of producing goods at a fraction of the cost. Many workers feared the machines themselves. To them, mechanization represented not progress, but unemployment. These fears would soon erupt into one of the first major worker protests of the industrial age, a movement that became famous across Britain. The Luddites, groups of workers who believed machines were destroying their way of life. They began organizing secret nighttime raids on factories. Armed with hammers, they smashed mechanized looms and textile machines. To them, these machines symbolized a new economic system that valued profit over people. The government responded harshly. Machine breaking was declared a serious crime. In some cases, it was punishable by death. Soldiers were deployed to protect factories. Industrialization, it seemed, was unstoppable. But the conflict revealed something important. The Industrial Revolution was not just a technological transformation. It was a social revolution. A revolution that reshaped how people worked, how they lived, and how societies organized themselves. Yet, even as factories spread across Britain, another breakthrough was about to amplify industrial power even further, a transportation revolution. Because factories could produce goods in massive quantities. But those goods still needed to be moved across cities, across countries, and eventually across continents. The solution would come from iron rails and steam locomotives, the railway age. And once railways arrived, the industrial world would expand faster than anyone had imagined. By the early 19th century, factories had become a defining feature of Britain's landscape. Across the country, tall brick buildings filled with machinery rose beside canals, rivers, and growing cities. Their windows glowed before sunrise. Their chimneys released dark columns of smoke into the sky. Inside these buildings, a new way of working had emerged. For thousands of years, most people had worked at their own pace. Farmers planted and harvested according to the seasons. Craftsmen controlled their own tools, their own schedules, and their own methods. Factories changed that. Work was no longer organized around the worker. Instead, the worker was organized around the machine. The workday began early, often before dawn. Factory bells rang through industrial towns, summoning workers from crowded neighborhoods toward the mills. Men, women, and children walked through narrow streets toward the enormous buildings that dominated their communities. Once inside, the doors closed, and the machinery began. Rows of spinning frames stretched across the factory floor. Belts connected the machines to rotating shafts overhead. These shafts were powered by water wheels or steam engines located elsewhere in the building. When the power engaged, hundreds of machines started moving at once. Spindles spun, threads twisted, metal parts clattered and vibrated. The sound was relentless. For workers, this noise became the background rhythm of everyday life. Conversation was nearly impossible. Instructions were often communicated with gestures or quick shouts between bursts of machinery. The pace of work was dictated by the speed of the machines. Workers could not simply slow down. If threads broke or materials jammed, they had to react quickly. Otherwise, the entire system could be disrupted. This constant pressure created an intense environment, one where attention and speed were essential. Factory labor required endurance. Shifts could last 12 hours or more. Breaks were brief. In many mills, the workday lasted from early morning until evening, 6 days a week. Sunday was usually the only day of rest. Yet even under these demanding conditions, factories continued attracting workers. For many rural families, factory wages, however modest, were more reliable than agricultural work. Industrial towns offered opportunity, but they also created new challenges. One of the most controversial aspects of early industrial labor was the widespread use of child workers. In many textile mills, children made up a significant portion of the workforce. Some were as young as 8 or 9 years old. In some cases, even younger. Factory owners valued children for several reasons. They could be paid less than adults. They were small enough to reach into tight spaces around machines, and they could be trained quickly to perform repetitive tasks. One common job for children was called a scavenger. Scavengers crawled beneath spinning machines to collect loose cotton fibers while the machines were still running. Another job was the piecer. Piecers repaired broken threads by quickly tying them together before the machine stopped. These tasks required constant attention, and they could be dangerous. If a worker's hand slipped or clothing became caught in moving machinery, injuries could happen instantly. Despite the risks, child labor was common throughout early industrial Britain. Many families depended on the extra income their children brought home. Parents, children, and sometimes grandparents all worked in the same factories. Industrial labor became a family enterprise. But the reality of factory life began attracting attention from social reformers. Visitors who toured the mills often described harsh conditions: long hours, crowded workspaces, poor ventilation. In some factories, discipline was strict. Late arrivals could face fines. Talking or slowing down might be punished. Factory owners argued that such discipline was necessary to maintain efficiency. After all, machines did not slow down. Workers had to keep pace. But critics began asking an important question. What were the human costs of industrial progress? As factories multiplied, the debate grew louder. Some believed industrialization represented the greatest economic advance in human history. Others feared it was creating a new form of exploitation. At the center of this conflict stood the machines themselves. To factory owners and investors, machines represented innovation, productivity, and profit. But to many traditional workers, machines represented something else entirely: a threat. For centuries, skilled craftsmen had controlled the production of goods. Weavers, for example, spent years mastering their trade. They owned their looms. They decided how and when they worked. Mechanized factories disrupted that system. Power looms and spinning frames could produce textiles far faster than hand labor. As factories expanded, many skilled workers found their trades becoming less valuable. Handloom weavers, once respected artisans, struggled to compete with machine-produced cloth. Their incomes declined. Their independence disappeared. Anger began spreading among workers who believed the new machines were destroying their livelihoods. Out of this anger emerged one of the most famous protest movements of the early industrial age: the Luddites. The name came from a mysterious figure known as Ned Ludd. According to legend, Ludd had once smashed a pair of knitting frames in protest. Whether he was real or not remains uncertain, but his name became a symbol. Beginning around 1811, groups of workers across parts of England began organizing secret attacks on factories. Under the cover of night, they gathered in masked groups, armed with hammers and tools. Their target was not factory owners themselves. It was the machines. They broke power looms. They destroyed knitting frames. They smashed mechanical equipment that they believed threatened their jobs. These actions spread quickly across industrial regions. Factories increased security. Owners hired guards. The British government responded with force. Thousands of soldiers were deployed to protect industrial areas. Machine breaking was declared a serious crime. In 1812, the government passed a law making the destruction of industrial machinery punishable by death. Several Luddites were eventually arrested, tried, and executed. The movement was suppressed, but its message echoed far beyond those early protests. The Luddites were not simply enemies of technology. They were workers struggling to adapt to a rapidly changing economic system, a system in which machines were reshaping society at an unprecedented speed. The Industrial Revolution had created enormous wealth. Factories produced goods faster than ever before. Trade expanded across continents. But the benefits of this new system were not distributed equally. Some became extremely rich. Others struggled to survive in crowded industrial towns. These tensions would shape the social and political debates of the 19th century. Governments would eventually introduce factory regulations. Reformers would campaign for shorter working hours and limits on child labor. And workers themselves would begin organizing into trade unions. The industrial world was still young. Its systems were still evolving. But one thing had become clear. Factories were no longer temporary experiments. They were the foundation of a new economic era. An era driven by machines, energy, and mass production. Yet even as factory life transformed the daily experience of millions, another revolution was quietly approaching. A revolution not inside factories, but outside them. Because factories could produce goods in astonishing quantities. But those goods needed to travel to markets across the country, and eventually across the globe. The next phase of the industrial transformation would solve that problem. It would reshape landscapes, it would shrink distances, and it would connect industrial cities in ways never before imagined. It would arrive in the form of iron tracks stretching across the countryside. and powerful steam locomotives racing along them. The railway age was about to begin. By the early 19th century, Britain had become the most industrialized society on Earth. Factories were multiplying, cities were growing, and machines powered by steam were transforming production. But industrial expansion created a new challenge. Factories could produce goods faster than ever before. Textiles, iron tools, machinery, and manufactured products flowed out of mills in enormous quantities. Yet transporting these goods remained slow and expensive. For centuries, most goods had traveled by horse-drawn wagons over rough roads. Even short journeys could take days. Canals improved the situation somewhat. Barges could carry heavy cargo along artificial waterways connecting industrial regions. But canals had limits. They were slow. They depended on water routes, and they could not easily reach every town or factory. Industrial Britain needed a faster and more reliable transportation system. The solution would emerge from the same source that powered factories: steam. The idea of using rails for transportation was not entirely new. In mining regions, simple wooden rails had long been used to guide carts filled with coal. Horses pulled these carts along narrow tracks, reducing friction and making heavy loads easier to move. But what if horses could be replaced by steam engines? Early inventors experimented with steam-powered locomotives throughout the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Most designs were unreliable. Some were simply too heavy for the rails. But engineers continued experimenting. One of the most important pioneers in this field was George Stephenson. Stephenson had grown up in a mining community and worked as an engineer maintaining steam engines in coal mines. He believed steam locomotives could revolutionize transportation. In 1814, Stephenson built one of his first successful locomotives for hauling coal wagons. It worked. But the real breakthrough came several years later. In 1825, the Stockton and Darlington Railway opened in northern England. This railway became the world's first public line to use steam locomotives for transporting goods and passengers. Crowds gathered to witness the event. When the locomotive began moving along the iron tracks, pulling a long train of wagons, it represented something extraordinary. A new age of transportation had begun. Yet the railway revolution truly accelerated a few years later. In 1830, the Liverpool and Manchester Railway opened. This line connected one of Britain's largest industrial cities, Manchester, with the major port of Liverpool. The railway allowed raw cotton arriving from overseas to reach Manchester's textile mills quickly. Finished cloth could then be transported back to Liverpool for export. What once took days by wagon or canal could now be completed in hours. Steam locomotives pulled long trains across the countryside at speeds that astonished observers. Some trains reached speeds of 30 miles per hour. To modern audiences, that might seem slow, but at the time, it felt almost unbelievable. People had never traveled that fast on land. Passengers described the sensation as both thrilling and slightly terrifying. Fields, villages, and hills seemed to fly past the windows. Railways quickly proved their value. They moved coal from mines to factories. They transported raw materials to industrial centers. And they carried finished goods to ports and markets across the country. Factories could now expand production even further, because transportation was no longer a major obstacle. As railway networks expanded across Britain, demand for key industrial materials exploded. Two industries in particular became central to the industrial economy: coal and iron. Coal had already been essential for powering steam engines. Now its importance increased even further. Steam locomotives required enormous quantities of coal to operate. Factories burned coal to generate steam. Cities used coal for heating and cooking. Mining operations expanded rapidly to meet this growing demand. Across northern England, deep coal mines appeared beneath the countryside. Miners descended underground through narrow shafts. In dark tunnels illuminated by small lamps, they extracted coal that would fuel the machines of the industrial world. Coal mining was extremely difficult and dangerous work. Miners faced risks from cave-ins, flooding, and gas explosions. Yet the industry continued expanding because coal had become the energy foundation of industrial society. Alongside coal, another material became equally important: iron. Factories needed iron to build machines. Railways needed iron for tracks and locomotives. Cities needed iron for bridges, tools, and construction. Iron production itself was undergoing a technological transformation. Earlier, iron-making methods had relied on charcoal derived from wood. But Britain's forests could not supply enough wood to support massive industrial expansion. The solution came from a new process using coke, a fuel made from coal. This innovation allowed furnaces to reach higher temperatures. Iron could now be produced in much larger quantities. Blast furnaces became a common sight in industrial regions. Tall stone structures where iron ore, coke, and limestone were heated together at intense temperatures. Molten iron flowed from the furnaces like glowing rivers of metal. Workers poured it into molds to create bars, tools, and machine parts. The combination of coal, iron, steam engines, and railways created a powerful industrial system. Each part strengthened the others. Railways transported coal. Coal powered factories and locomotives. Factories produced iron and machinery. Iron built more railways. It was a cycle of accelerating industrial growth. By the middle of the 19th century, Britain possessed one of the most advanced transportation networks in the world. Railways stretched across the country. Industrial cities were connected like never before. Travel times shrank dramatically. What once required days now took only hours. Goods moved quickly between factories, ports, and markets. And the effects of this transformation extended far beyond Britain itself. British engineers exported railway technology around the globe. Railways appeared across Europe, North America, India, and Latin America. Industrialization was beginning to spread. But even as machines, mines, and railways reshaped economies, the human consequences of industrialization continued to unfold. Industrial cities kept growing. Population surged. New social classes emerged. A powerful industrial middle class of factory owners, investors, and entrepreneurs accumulated enormous wealth. At the same time, millions of workers lived in crowded urban neighborhoods, laboring long hours in factories and mines. This new industrial society raised difficult questions. Who should benefit from industrial progress? What responsibilities did factory owners have toward their workers? And how should governments respond to the social challenges created by rapid industrial growth? These questions would dominate political debates throughout the 19th century. Reformers would demand better working conditions. Workers would organize to demand rights and representation. New political movements would emerge, shaped by the realities of industrial life. The Industrial Revolution had begun as a transformation of machines and factories. But it was quickly becoming something much larger, a transformation of society itself. And the story of the industrial world was far from finished. Because the systems first developed in Britain, factories, steam power, railways, and mass production would soon spread across the globe, reshaping economies, redefining labor, and setting humanity on a path toward the modern industrial age. But to understand the true impact of this transformation, we must look beyond the machines and the railways. We must look at the lives of the people who lived through it. The workers, the reformers, the thinkers who tried to understand this new industrial society. Because the final chapter of this story is not only about industry, it is about how humanity adapted to a world powered by machines.
By the middle of the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution had transformed Britain beyond recognition. Factories filled the landscapes of industrial regions. Railways stretched across the countryside. Steam engines powered mines, mills, and machines. Cities that had once been modest towns now held hundreds of thousands of people. But the Industrial Revolution was never just about machines. It was also about people. Millions of ordinary men, women, and children were living through one of the most dramatic social transformations in human history. And the effects of this transformation could be seen everywhere in industrial Britain. The population of cities grew at extraordinary speed. In the early 1700s, only a small percentage of the population lived in urban areas. But as factories multiplied, rural workers migrated toward industrial centers in search of employment. Cities such as Manchester, Birmingham, Leeds, and Liverpool expanded rapidly. Entire neighborhoods were built almost overnight. Rows of brick houses appeared along narrow streets near factories and mills. These homes were often small and crowded. Several members of the same family might share a single room. Sanitation was limited. Clean water was difficult to access. Waste accumulated in open drains and alleys. In these conditions, disease spread easily. Epidemics of cholera and typhoid swept through industrial cities during the 19th century. To visitors from rural areas, the environment of industrial cities could seem shocking. Thick smoke from coal fires darkened the sky. Factory chimneys released soot that settled on streets and buildings. The air carried the constant sounds of industry: steam engines, metal hammers, and the rumble of trains. Yet, despite these conditions, cities continued attracting people. Because industry offered opportunity. Factory wages were often higher than agricultural income. Industrial employment provided a degree of stability that rural labor could not always guarantee. Over time, a new social structure began to emerge. Industrial society was divided into distinct classes. At the top stood a growing group of industrial entrepreneurs and investors. These individuals owned factories, mines, railways, and commercial enterprises. Some accumulated enormous fortunes. Their wealth allowed them to build large homes, invest in new technologies, and influence politics. Beneath them emerged a powerful middle class. Merchants, engineers, managers, accountants, and professionals formed the backbone of industrial administration. Education and technical expertise became increasingly valuable in this new economy. But the largest group within industrial society was the working class: factory laborers, mine workers, railway workers, construction laborers. These workers powered the industrial economy through long hours of physical labor. For many, life remained difficult. But over time, workers began organizing to demand change. During the early years of industrialization, labor laws were minimal. Factory owners largely determined wages, hours, and conditions. But as industrial cities grew, public concern about working conditions also increased. Reformers began investigating life inside factories and mines. Writers, journalists, and social observers documented the realities of industrial labor. Some reports described children working extremely long hours. Others revealed dangerous conditions in mines and mills. These accounts sparked public debate. Gradually, governments began introducing regulations designed to limit the most severe abuses. In 1833, the British Parliament passed the Factory Act, one of the first major attempts to regulate factory labor. The law restricted the working hours of children and required basic inspections of factories. Later reforms introduced additional protections. Working hours for children were further limited. Education requirements were introduced for young workers. Safety regulations slowly improved conditions inside industrial workplaces. These reforms did not eliminate hardship, but they marked an important shift. Governments were beginning to recognize that industrial societies required new forms of regulation. At the same time, workers themselves began forming organizations to protect their interests. Trade unions emerged as groups of workers united around common goals. Their purpose was simple: to negotiate wages, to demand safer working conditions, and to give workers a collective voice in industrial society. Early unions often faced resistance from factory owners and government authorities. In some cases, union activities were restricted or outlawed, but the idea of collective organization proved powerful. Over time, labor movements expanded across Britain and other industrializing nations. Industrialization was also inspiring new political and economic ideas. Philosophers and economists debated the meaning of industrial progress. Some thinkers celebrated the productivity and wealth generated by industry. They argued that industrial capitalism encouraged innovation, competition, and economic growth. Others were more critical. Observers such as Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels argued that industrial capitalism created deep inequalities between workers and factory owners. They believed the industrial system concentrated wealth in the hands of a small elite, while millions of workers struggled under harsh conditions. Their writings would go on to influence political movements across the world. Whether praised or criticized, industrialization was clearly transforming global society. The systems pioneered in Britain were spreading rapidly to other nations. Factories appeared across Europe. Industrial centers emerged in Germany, France, and Belgium. Across the Atlantic, the United States began developing its own powerful industrial economy. Railways connected continents. Steamships revolutionized global trade. Industrial technology expanded into Asia, Latin America, and beyond. What had begun as a regional transformation in Britain was becoming a global phenomenon. The factory system, the very concept of large-scale mechanized production, became the dominant economic model of the modern world. Mass production allowed goods to be manufactured at unprecedented scales. Clothing, tools, machinery, and household products became more affordable for ordinary people. Standards of living gradually improved over the long term. But the transition was never simple. Industrialization disrupted traditional ways of life. Rural communities changed, craft traditions declined, and societies struggled to adapt to the rapid pace of technological and economic change. Yet despite these challenges, the industrial age continued advancing. New technologies appeared throughout the 19th century: electric power, telegraph communication, steel production, chemical manufacturing. Each innovation built upon the foundations first established in the early factories of Britain. And those early factories, powered by water wheels and steam engines, had set something extraordinary in motion. They had begun a process that reshaped humanity's relationship with work, technology, and energy. For thousands of years, human production had depended primarily on muscle power, human strength, animal strength, wind and water. But the Industrial Revolution introduced a new reality. Machines powered by fossil fuels could perform work on a scale far beyond human capability. This shift unleashed unprecedented productivity. It also laid the foundations for the modern world. Today, the legacy of the Industrial Revolution surrounds us. Modern factories, global supply chains, urban societies, technological innovation, all trace their origins back to the moment when Britain's first factories began operating beside rivers in the late 18th century. Those early industrial buildings may have seemed like simple experiments at the time, but they represented the birth of something far larger: the industrial world. A world defined by machines, energy, and mass production. A world that continues evolving even today. And it all began with the first factories of Britain, where the rhythm of spinning machines and steam engines signaled the beginning of a new chapter in human history, the Age of Industry.